Engels certainly was not worse than Marx as a Marxist. One can say, in many respects, he was the one who gave birth to a lot of Marx ideas. So they originated in Engels' head, in Engels' writings. Even a lot of famous formulations that we know from Marx writings originally come from Engels. Engels was a pioneer in many respects. He was the one who started the project of a critique of political economy. He was the one who started the project to follow and to study the development of the natural sciences in connection with the social sciences. He did a lot as a historian and went much further than Marx did. You can mention a lot of, we can mention a lot of occasions or fields where Engels went further than Marx ever did. For instance, in terms of anthropology, ethnology, or religious studies, or military studies, international politics. So Engels was his own man and had a lot to contribute to the joint project of Marxism. And without him, Marx would certainly not have achieved what he could eventually achieve. Engels was the one who embraced the term that had been coined by their opponents, by their enemies of Marxism, and turned it around and turned it into something like an honorary title. He is the one who did most for the propagation and simply for making known Marx and his own ideas. In the 1870s, Marx already was a renowned figure, but nobody except a small group of intellectuals, of scholars, actually read him. Engels was the one whose writings, whose works were widespread and read by many, many people. So it was via Engels' work that also a lot of young, budding, future Marxists for the first time came into contact with this kind of thought. So Engels did a lot, and without him, the historical change that took place in the 1880s, 1890s, when large parts of the European labor movement became Marxist, would never have happened. Engels certainly did not distort Marx thought. This is mostly uttered by critics of his work as an editor of Marx Capital. But Engels, first he did an astonishing, an awful job, an awesome job, not an awful job, of course, as an editor, because what Marx had left him was a huge pile of manuscripts, fragments, etc. He had never finished the job. Engels did. Engels produced volume 2 and 3 of Capital in a readable form. He changed the text, he intervened, so it is an addition. But one can say there is not one single item where you can actually prove that Engels distorted the intentions of the author Marx. He presented clearly for everybody who could read and who can still read today the character of a manuscript as a very first sketch, and that there were a lot of open problems. So without Engels, we would not even know that. First, his work of youth, published in 1845, on the condition of the working class in England, which is a pioneering work in many respects, even in urban sociology, but also theoretically very interesting and a core advance in the thought of Marx and Engels, because there Engels is the first one to give a clear analysis of what the peculiarities, the specificities of the modern wage labor relationship actually is. He also develops a theory of employment and unemployment, and he develops a whole analysis of the labor movement, how out of the miserable circumstances of life, the demoralizing circumstances of life of the modern working class in industrial England, something like a labor movement could arise. So it's also a pioneering work in the analysis of social movements, social mass movements, one should keep in mind. Second, I would recommend Engels' small book on the peasant war in Germany from 1850, where he gives a class analysis, and one can discuss whether this is really apt for the situation in Germany in the early 16th century that he's dealing with. But in methodological terms, it is very instructive, because Engels shows that it's not just the everyday life situation of different classes of people, not only their economic relations, it is also their way of life and the ideological field, their way of thinking, of believing. In the time that he is analyzing, it's all about religion, why people think, even the revolutionaries think in terms of religious solutions, salvation, introducing a new kind of Christian brotherhood of man, why this worked under these circumstances. So it's a very rich analysis. It's not an original work in terms of historical research. It's more a work in terms of interpretation of what we already know. Also, in this book, Engels analyzes, not for the first time, why revolutions fail. And that has always been a very important lesson for himself and for Marx. Thirdly, I would recommend his work on the origin of the family, private property, and the state. First and foremost, because in this work, he is restating, in a situation where nobody knew anything about the work done by Marx and Engels together in 1846, 45 to 47, that is today known as a German ideology. Nobody knew about it because it hadn't been published. So Engels is restating the double-pronged approach that he and Marx shared, and that he and Marx thought essential for what they called the materialist conception of history, or what we today know as historical materialism, although Marx never used this shorthand, and Engels also only in the 1890s a few times. Engels emphasizes, well, it's not just about material production, the forces of production that exist in the world of material production. It is also about intellectual production, and first and foremost, and it is first and foremost about social reproduction. So about the relations between the genders, about families, about generations, about education, and so on. In this book, Engels gives an explanation where the patriarchat comes from, and how it arose in historical times, long thousands of years before the emergence of modern capitalism. Furthermore, his book is also quite important for state theory, because he is dealing with the emergence of statehood in very early times. Again, the state is much older than modern capitalism. And he already shows that this is a highly complex institution which has many functions, and it is not just a machine of oppression or a machine of class domination. It's much more than that, and much more complicated than that. So there you find it in Engels, in this text of Engels, published in 1884. then I would still recommend his work, polemical work from the 1870s against a German professor today, rather unknown, Eugen Dühring. So we also all know it under the shorthand anti-Dühring. It is recommendable because Engels defends his and Marx's views against many misinterpretations. He corrects a lot of misinterpretations. He adds a lot, and he popularizes in a brilliant way. Makes it much clearer in the popularized form than it is in the original form in Marx's writings. And that to do this, or to be able to do this, would be an enormous asset for the Marxists of today, who very often dislike Engels because he was such a brilliant popularizer. Well, the dialectic of nature, which is often debated, in particular by Marxist philosophers, is also recommendable, also only with the proviso that this is a book that Engels never wrote, and certainly would never have ever have published in this form in which he left it. It's about 200 very different texts, some very long, some very much elaborated, some just a few notes. And it's a document of his about 10-year studies, intense studies of the recent development of the natural sciences, in particular in the 19th century, which are linked to the development of industrial capitalism. And Engels is arguing against the theoretical blockades that existed in the thinking of the contemporary physicists, chemists, etc. And he's trying to remind them, well, you would make much more progress if you would not stick to old metaphysical ways of thinking and accept that there is something that has already been developed in philosophy called dialectics that will allow you to think dynamically, to think in terms of developments, continuities, discontinuities, ruptures, increasing complexity, etc. That is what Engels is pleading for, and it's completely secondary and unimportant whether the way in which he presented dialectics in 3 or 4 laws, whether this is the most apt form or not. The intention is very important. So if you read it, when you read it, you should be aware of the overall intention, the overall thrust of this book. Unfortunately, we don't have it in the form in which Engels might have eventually finished and published it. We are at the end of the Engels-Year. It was quite clear that this year would not create a hype as the Marx year 2018. Far from that, because Engels is still in the shadow of Marx, which is not correct. So my hope is that a lot of the misgivings and misinterpretations and distorted views about Engels have been a little bit corrected by some of the contributions made during this year. A lot of the events planned could not take place in the way in which they were planned. They were either shifted into the future, so next year we will still see some international events, international conferences continuing on this topic. And a lot of them have shifted to online events or podcasts and so on. In Engels' birthplace, the town city called Wuppertal today, a lot has been organized, a very well done exhibition on Engels and his life, many lectures, many smaller and larger meetings. Podcasts have been organized. I have myself done a lot with the German trade unions, with the Social Democratic Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, with the scientific bureau and organization of the Linke, of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. But again, a lot had to be shifted or transformed into online events. We have published a lot, in particular in German. You have a lot of new publications. My own book on Engels, called How a Cotton Lord Invented Marxism, has been published in German, but in the meantime also in Spanish. So I would expect that a lot of this will also be translated into English, and there will be more in the next year, certainly also in China, where our colleagues are now working on translations and on the preparation of larger volumes on Engels' contribution to Marxism. Engels is a central figure in the history of Marxism. He is still a central thinker in the tradition of Marxism. He is not the gospel, as Marx never was, but without him, you will hardly be able to fully understand what Marx and he together intended to do in the world, and in the world of politics and in the world of the social sciences. Thank you very much for your patience and attention.